I'm curious, did any in-studio artists decide to do smoke and smokestacks? The impressionists are outside, they see it, they live it. But why not an in-studio professional? Do you know anyone manage it?
Um, it's a good question, thank you. I haven't looked into it so far. I mean, effectively, it's about um, representations of smokestacks from an interior space.
Yeah, given this music.
Okay, yeah. As I say, I haven't really looked into it, but it would be something that I think that would be a useful point of comparison. So thank you for the suggestion. I mean, I suppose that the first thing that comes to mind there, in terms of the discussion that I'm trying to offer is so where you would be inside and looking out at the smokestack. Um, in a sense, I guess that would, so you would probably be looking at through some sort of aperture, through a window or something of that sort. So, in a sense, that would again kind of define, in terms of the dimensions that you would be seeing of the perception of the smokestack. So, I suppose what I could then look at, which would be kind of another place to go to, would be to say, what happens when you are inside looking out, because that is precisely giving you a specific idea of the enclosure, a sense of almost claustrophobia, perhaps, that would come with that. I don't know. I would like to look into it, because the thing that I'm thinking about here is is Baudelaire. When Baudelaire kind of offers this idea of looking at, kind of looking out kind of from a window, or indeed looking into a window, but particularly here, kind of the idea of looking out from the window and that constrained perspective, kind of, which you can then kind of see, kind of it gives you a different kind of insight into the landscape. That is not what you would encounter with a painting, which is, in a sense, an open perspective. Um, so yes, so I don't have anybody in mind at the moment, but I will look into it. Thank you for the thought.
So I'd like to continue querying you. Thank you. The photographs of the paintings were just amazing. They're so beautiful. But my question is, reading them the way that you have done is illuminating and scary. Do you think that the painters were consciously aware of the kind of interpretation that you're giving us? I'm sure you've been asked this question before. I'm sure you've been asking yourself this question, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's true. Kind of, it's a very important and pressing question. At this stage, I haven't looked into, say, diaries or correspondence or that sort of thing to say, is there a sense in which Monet or Pissarro or Seurat and so on kind of were emphasising these ideas. I suppose it comes back to the element that I was to which I was drawing attention to with the quotations at the beginning. So thinking about so the artist offers us a certain perspective on the landscape, and so we'll present kind of elements in a certain way. And what we can do is we can read. There's a certain narrative that may emerge more obviously from a painting, but also what we can do by kind of reading in this way is to defamiliarize what the kind of the artist has produced. So to say, to shift the discourse and say. Perhaps this was kind of not kind of the intent to portray kind of industry in this way, and that's something that, I mean, if there is evidence of that, I'd love to find it. That would be great. But if even if that doesn't exist, there is a sense in which what I would like to explore is just rereading these canonical paintings in a way that is very pressing and relevant to kind of the industrial situation.
To the extent that all of these men were very good friends with Zola,
Yeah.
and that Zola was so aware of what was going on,
Absolutely.
one would assume that there was some kind of a discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And sorry, just to come back to that, is to say that one of the places that this started as a project was thinking about Germinal, and Pauline mentioned Karen Pincus, and she's written on the representation of climate change in in Germinal, and even thinking about the smoke, the representation of that. So one of the places that I'm intending to go with the project more generally is to say, where are these links between people who seem to be thinking about industry and the impact of industry on the landscape. So you're quite right. Zola would be a good place to go. Thank you.
I have a question for each of you. So first, so Daniel, I would like to know if you could expand your thoughts on the materiality of the painting. You talked about the particles of the smokestacks, and what do you make of the fact that Impressionism is like brush strokes as well, and it has often been interpreted as something like giving the impression, something kind of harmonious, whereas it will more go in your following your interpretation, it will be maybe more something about fragmentation and tensions. And for Pauline, my question was, I never heard of that etymology of environment. I always thought it was related to what's environ, which is like create this sense of difference between the subject and the object, and which have been discussed in modern philosophy in relation to Cartesianism. And so you relate it to vibrate and even to veer, which is more like an active sense. It's maybe a sort of agency. I don't know. Like I would like you to expand on that too. Thank you. Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Great question. I suppose yes, exactly. There is a sense in which kind of materiality kind of is something that kind of I want to think about more, and not only within the painting. So kind of in terms of the way the painting was produced, but actually kind of the materials of the painting itself. So when you're talking about brushstrokes and this idea kind of that there is kind of in the work of many impressionists, there's a sense of harmony, kind of something kind of which is being kind of represented there, kind of in a way kind of that kind of has a sense of something that is aesthetically pleasing. That is one area, and the other area of materiality is particularly to do with kind of the constituent parts. So the first area, just to say, yes, kind of what I'm saying is kind of that what we're looking at, kind of the way in which kind of the plumes of smoke are being represented, those are a challenge to the harmony of the painting. So they are something which is a dissonant element. But particularly kind of in the paintings where the plumes are very evident. But what I then want to look into more is the cases like the Seurat at the end, which is precisely where the smoke seems to be kind of less disruptive, seems to kind of have been almost subsumed kind of into the discourse. I mean, in fact, kind of there is being fitted into something which is more harmonious, perhaps. So that tension there is something that I still want to explore. And of course, that's a different style. So if you compare the Monet and the Seurat, the brushstrokes and so on are different. So looking at that, but the second element, which again I didn't mention much, but I'd like to go into more, which is about the materiality actually of the paintings themselves. So the composition, and this is where if anybody's got any suggestions or ideas, or what I would really appreciate them, is particularly to do with how you could look at the paintings and look at their material composition and whether there is evidence in them of the impact of precisely because they were painted outside. To come back to the first question, whether there is a sense of them being having something imbued in them, which is evidence of industry or evidence of the landscape. So that's an aspiration as opposed to something that I looked at so far, but I'd certainly look into it.
Right, and so I don't know where to start. I think I always wanted the word environment more than the word ecology to make more sense of that, especially talking about it in the early modern period. I feel like you always have that anachronism aspect of things, and environment, especially as it appeared in the 14th century with Veneto Latini, allowed me to detour that. So that's why I came to it at the beginning. And then I started realizing that it was actually really interesting the way that the word had been formed, because it was a verb before it was the noun. And so originally it's Karen Pincus so the article is The Risks of Sustainability. She talks about the Odyssey, so it's a very sort of maritime article. And at some point she does go into the etymology, and it is, I mean, you can find it, whether it's the Oxford English Dictionary or the sort of French dictionaries that tell you about etymology, they all say that it comes from that. So it's vibrate, and there's also veer. And that's actually the only place that shows both of those things is I'm going to pronounce it that awfully, if anyone knows German, it's the etymological dictionary, the Warter, whatever, something. It's beautiful. I spend hours just looking at those pages, and there are a few pages on Viron, because it's all the way I understand it. It's very hard to understand if you're not a linguist, so I don't claim that I do. But it's just list of the many variations of Viron, of the sort of root vir, in whether it's German, it's French. There is all the regional also dialects of French. There's Italian, I think. So all of those things in like blocks of just words launched at you, and it's very clear that there's all these dimensions of promenade. It's also the ronde in the sense of like dancing. All of that is viron, which gives you environment. I guess that's one answer. Also, some people have taken on that etymology as well with the recent volume of Veer ecology. So, backing that up, yeah.
Thank you. Question here? Yes.
Yes, thank you, Pauline, for your talk. It was very interesting, and in fact, I think you are really trying to shed some light on our, political problem. In fact, I think we are in a sort of double bind because we need to recognize that we are in a very tragic situation. But if we only recognize it as a tragic situation, we could be paralyzed. And so I understood your attempt to think about the comics, the comical, as a way to escape this trap. That is to say, to recognize tragedy without being, stuck in it. And because there will be a bad way to escape tragedy. It will be like the comical understood, in the terms of Hegel, as a way to create an absolute distance between us and the situation. But I think you said something very different. You spoke about, queer ecology as a way to recognize a failure. So it's more à la Beckett, and we spoke about Beckett,
Exactly,
but I thought
yeah.
a lot about Beckett during your talk. So I have sort of really a question, or maybe my question will be, I thought about your last propositions, okay, about fiction, for example. My question would be maybe, I don't know exactly, but maybe could you speak a little bit more about your approach to the comical or comedy, and how the comical could be a way to lead our political solutions.
Thank you. You pinpointed the moment where I'm at, which is that I'm trying that. I'm happy you picked up on Beckett because it's something that I've tried to articulate in the chapter I'm writing for the Early Modern Ecologies volume, and Philip's response to that was, that's quite a brutal transition there. You're going to have to walk me through it. And I ended up giving it up because I wasn't sure that I was there yet, because it's, you get your early modern things and then boom, Beckett. But that's the idea, though. It's the fact that I've seen two representations of fin de partie around the year 2009, 10, 11 in France, one at the Musée de l'Odéon and one at the, I believe, TNT in Toulouse. And one was completely bleak and one was extremely funny. And more, there was a certain sense of joy in there. And to me, it's strange that this work, it's not strange, I see it as the capacity of the absurd to do that. But then if we're going to reread the absurd with environmental implications, then that sense of comedy and tragedy that is in there underlying, and that stage directors can just sort of pick and choose or give the tone that they want, is important to what I'm trying to do, but I don't know how to approach that. Something else that, two things led me to that is the chapter on the Diogenes preface thing, because I felt like what Diogenes was doing was very Beckett, indeed. And also it was deeply steeped in Rabelaisian satire, which led me to think of comedy, but mostly also about satire and also about cynicism, but in the ancient definition of it. And then on the other side of that, there are other moments also in Rabelais that have made me think of satire more in environmental sense. It's hard to articulate yet, but also I think it's also the key to reading Rabelais, yes, as the funny, less as the funny guy, and Montaigne less as the serious guy, because they do have that in common. And to me, it's also a certain environmental awareness about an epistemological shift that was happening at the time. I hope that answers. Yeah. That's all the answer I have so far, but I'm happy for comments.
It's for Daniel, just a comment, but there are a few. There are a few studies right now in the scientific domain about coal particles and in the sky, and they are taking paintings from the English painters, mostly from Turner, for example, and they're making expertise from the colors of the skies to just measure the amount of particles in the sky. So you can find some information into the scientific domains regarding. It was not strictly pollution from coal extraction. It was pollution from the explosion of the volcano Tambora in 1814. But they're using right now pictures, paintings from the 19th century to make expertise to know exactly the skies were totally messed up by these volcanoes eruptions, and also studying paintings for the pollution rate. So I know there's a Greek study that took 100 paintings of 19th century to measure pollution air. So you can find in this domain so maybe some information to complete your leads about impressionism.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic. I mean, yeah, I'll have to look. I mean, you don't have an idea about the Greek study, do you? About
It's in my computer, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's, yeah. Yes, in that case, definitely, please, thank you. And yes, and so the one you mentioned, which was about studies of eruption. So the 1840, is it? It's not the project that's happening in the UK at the moment, is it? Because there's an Arts and Humanities Research Council project.
It's a book from Gillian Darcywood. It's Tambora, the year the volcano that destroyed the weather, or something like this. It's about the 1814, 1815, and 1816, and it was about the weather in England and in all Europe that has been disturbed by this volcano eruption in Indonesia. So it's a book that's been published in 2014 or something.
Okay. Great. Yes, thank you very much. Because so I have a colleague who is at the University of Bristol, who is working now with earth scientists, particularly kind of on this issue, which is to do with volcanology and eruptions, and the way in which that can be seen. That is primarily to do with narratives of eruptions, so really to do with the way in which they're represented, and then putting that alongside science. But yes, I was precisely thinking about the way in which that could expand into more collaborations between people in, say, earth sciences and than people working in the humanities, to then say, okay, we can use these pieces of data together and to make something really compelling across the disciplines. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, that's a question for Pauline. I really appreciate your presentation. I did have issues with your conclusion that the role of literature was to teach us to live ironically in the situation we're doomed to live in. I mean, maybe it's what it is, but it's pessimistic, and I was wondering if it's like something, you say something that literature can teach to people, but it's also one of the symptoms that takes literature away from its readers, like that we fail to have a committed literature when it comes to the question of the environment, as opposed to other social problems. So I was wondering of why you choose to focus in this direction of literature, like this ironical stance, because I'm not sure I like the conclusion of it. And while I value the lesson of this kind of ironical literature, I'm not sure it's, first of all, really taking us anywhere. And well, I mean, I do believe in a more committed literature, and we do that, like, especially like in this country on the subject of like race, feminism, and so on. Why not with the environment? And why are we doomed to repeat the same eternal like circle of failure while laughing at ourselves as we do it?
Oh, thank you. So I'm not sure I like it either. I don't know, but so you're saying that your point would be that we need a committed literature, and that making that literature ironic or satirical would defeat the purpose. Is that what you're saying? Correct. Sorry.
I'm not saying we can produce literature according to what we need, because it's not as any other material good. So maybe we can't like have an agenda and then write literature that corresponds to it.
Right. Okay. I see. I see. How can I do that? I'm having a bit of an absence here. So first of all, so I think I can look at the book "Learning to Die in the Anthropocene," the Roy Scranton book. It's very short, and his point is sort of I think maybe I summed it up not well enough, but it's that if it's going to happen anyway, you know, what does that where does that leave us as a civilization? What do we want to keep? Can we keep anything? And it's something also about renewing the role of the humanities, revalorizing it. So that's where he's at. My point when I read it was amazing book. You know, we need this sort of thinking, but it's also an impasse in some ways because it is this pessimistic thing. My response to you in some ways to, you know, to the fact that, you know, it's not taking us anywhere. Was Beckett taking you anywhere? You know, was Nietzsche taking you anywhere? I feel like it's in that sort of impasse thinking, which has a value, in my opinion. And what I was trying to do while using Roy Scranton was thinking, okay, why did he parody Montaigne's que de philosopher, c'est apprendre à mourir, if he wasn't going to really take all of the teachings that essay has? So I don't do that effectively here. But to me, it's something to do with not only, okay, we're going to die, so, you know, what do we do next? It's more, how do we die? And in Montaigne, I think it has to do with reaching a sense of calm. And then what I'm trying to do is bring in maybe an alternative to that impasse with what if laughing about it or creating a kind of satire about it was not an impasse? And I'm not sure I have an answer to that yet, but I'm just asking the question and trying to sort out a corpus that helps me think through that. I'm not saying, I don't think in any way that we should create a literature that is committed, but also that is doing something. I don't really believe in that. But that we look at fables and what they've done and what they're doing and what they will do as fables, not as versions of a truth that can teach us something really about how we can do things. I don't even know if that makes sense, but I'm there.
Thank you both for your talks. My question is actually for Pauline. I'm not sure if you have read Joseph Meeker's The Comedy of Survival. It's a 1974 book. And the subtitle is Literary Ecology and a Play Ethic. And he actually arrives at a very similar conclusion, thinking about comedy not as laughter or optimism, but instead as kind of a failed, bumbling protagonist who cyclically gets it wrong every time. And for him, it's he falls into the problem of reductionism at moments because he's very inspired by ecology as a model. So he says this is how humans and animals and other creatures survive, is this through this kind of bumbling act. But I wanted to maybe push you a little bit further on the role of play. So you've talked about the kind of satirical, right, posture, the irony, the role of failure. So what does play come, if we're trying to avoid the kind of optimism, pessimism, the light, darkness, where's play? And then I'd love to hear more about kind of how Montaigne or these earlier texts you're looking at talk about play.
Play?
Yeah.
That is so interesting. I really honestly did not think of it, and it would be really interesting to think about it, probably because Diogenes plays with his barrel, and then Montaigne plays very famously with his cat, which I'm sure you know. So yeah, that is interesting, because what I'm interested in the way people have formulated queer ecologies is mostly that, I guess, gratuitous aspect of that movement, which is play also. So a very influent article for me was Carl Schnuver. It was about slow cinema's laboring body. And he was the one who take on this queer temporality of being outside of the productivity of regular, I guess, cinema in that case, but just society in general and capitalism, and just looking at art, and then probably also at fables and just fiction as existing in another temporality that is not productive. So play is really interesting, but I will have to think about that more, because off of the top of my head, I'm thinking of, Gargantua playing, all like the list of games, of toys, I guess, the list of boarding games while it rains, and how that contrasts to his education. So that's just early modern talk, so I don't know that it answers. But I know also that Todorov had a book on play that I have not looked at, but probably looking at that could also play in literature, sort of the role of play. I don't know the title, I don't remember it. It's one of those books that you hear talked about and you never read. So, but thank you.
Hi, sorry, I had a question as well. Just re a kind of more general point about the way that the Impressionists were, and the people who came after them, painters around that time, were dealing with industrial scenes. Do you see the way in that they were dealing with kind of landscapes, the series that, for example, the various series that Monet painted of haystacks, cathedrals in various different weather conditions, and then obviously very famously the Nuncia. Do you see that as working contrary to the engagement with the kind of more industrial landscape, or kind of in the similar vein of trying to stabilize the natural object?
Good question. I suppose kind of the place that I would start is to say that the way that I'm treating these paintings at the moment, as you can see from the presentation, is really much more as sort of singularities, and saying, what can we pick out there, and then if we put these together, and then and address them kind of in series. So it's not necessarily kind of that the painters themselves conceive of a series of paintings from the same place, kind of looking at industry. In fact, I haven't found any evidence of that yet, but I would be interested if anybody has any ideas. In contrast to, say, paintings of the Mont Saint-Victoire or something like that, where we have a profusion of paintings in that sort of series, and the ones that you mentioned quite right. At the moment, I haven't found any evidence of the industrial paintings as series, but what I would like to do is to say that this is indicative of a certain moment. So even if it's not one painter painting the same scene multiple times, it's a fascination of something that is there. Even if it's not overtly, it might be something which is perhaps present at a subconscious level or something like that, and exploring that and putting them together. So the reason that I put paintings together without necessarily saying, okay, this is a painting of the same place, or this is a painting of the same type of scene, is to try and create a constellation effectively. To go a bit Mallarmé there for a second, but to basically put all of these things together and to see, and again to borrow another 19th century term, to talk about correspondences, and then how these things could fit together, and how they can inform each other by being put next to each other. Because I haven't found any evidence yet of this being addressed in a particular way, which is to do with saying, okay, if we put all of these paintings in series, what do we see? So yes, absolutely great question. And as I say, if anybody's got any ideas about paintings that have been done of sort of series of the same place, which is particularly highlighting industry, that would be great.
I have a suggestion that's about the sequence or diffusion, if you will, of industrial images that could be located in the submissions to the Paris Salon. And there's actually a database that I forget the name of, but an art historian named Diana Greenwald has leveraged it in her papers related to kind of the beginning with sort of the gleaners, right, and the notion, the diffusion, if you will, through 19th century French Salon, Paris Salon submissions of images of working people, right, and the proletariat. So. That database is referenced, and her methodology is referenced in her papers, and it might be that you could, from that database of all the submissions to the Paris Salon, there could be something in there related to industrialization of the paintings.
Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you. Because I was talking kind of about this with a colleague while I was in Edinburgh just before coming here, and somebody was asking particularly about where did these paintings appear? So who was looking at them? Kind of did they appear kind of in kind of the salon kind of event? And of course, kind of we know about kind of the salon of the refused and so on. So that is certainly kind of something that I'd like to look into. Kind of to say. Yes, certainly searching and saying representations of industry kind of at the salon and see whether there's a particular sort of spike in those, but also just saying are these paintings specifically not present there, and is it because they're outside kind of a prevailing narrative that they are painting these scenes in this way? So thank you for the pointer in that direction. I'll certainly have a look kind of at the articles and then look into that database.
Hi, thank you both. I had a question, speaking of correspondences, about whether or not, you talked a lot about smokestacks that we see like aux alentours des villes, so on the outskirts of cities. But I thought, for example, of a painting by Caillebotte where he shows the Parisian rooftops and all of the chimneys coming out, and it's sort of, they're across the horizon. And so I was wondering if you're thinking about the role of the city itself in the industrial scene. And that makes me wonder about like what is our individual role in the kind of pollution that is coming from these structures entering the sky. And as far as getting from Rabelais to Beckett, I think it might be interesting to think about the kinds of bodies that they put in these environments. And we see in Rabelais, and Bakhtin tells us that this body is a kind of regenerative one. And I wonder if Beckett is not giving us the regenerative body, but also in some ways liberating the body and its environment by fragmenting it. So anyway, that might be a way in. Thank
you. Yes, so to come first to the question about the representations of cities, and then I'll come back to the question, which is sort of how more generally about how this might inspire us to take action on an individual level, or the sorts of actions that were taken on an individual level in the 19th century. Is it sort of okay, sure. Yeah, why not? So on the first front, yes, so the Caillebotte painting that you mentioned, and indeed kind of other ones that I've been thinking about recently. There's a painting by Delahaye kind of the gas factory at Clichy and so on, which is these are very present in urban settings. And but what I've tried to do here, I didn't mention it specifically, but you may have sensed it from the way that I was approaching, was to go outside Paris and particularly kind of when you're talking about the alentour, to look at the sort of the periphery, kind of, and moving away from the centre of cities. So what interests me in the broader project is to look at regional industrialisation and how that is represented in places that are kind of on the outskirts of cities, kind of, or kind of moving away kind of from the centre of major spaces, major urban spaces. So specifically what I'm looking at here is changing the perspective from looking at cities of which there are, you're quite right, numerous paintings where you can identify smokestacks in the city, but I suppose what I'm looking at here is that moment where you transition out of the city and away. So one of the points kind of that I will be looking at is saying, okay, this is how these paintings are different from ones which are specifically of cities. So I'll come back to that kind of at another point, but the project is sort of moving away from sort of Paris as the capital of the 19th century and going elsewhere. The second point, which is about the role of individuals, that I think is an exciting point, and not something that I've kind of looked into particularly yet. But the question, which is, did this motivate people in the 19th century, by looking at these paintings, did this motivate people in the 19th century to take action about pollution and smokestacks? That's something that I could look into and indeed will look into, because I don't have a sense of what the responses to these paintings were in terms of was there a sort of a consistent response to people looking at the smokestacks in these paintings and thinking, yes, we should do something about that, or was that just accepted and so on? So reception theory there to look into, yes.
Danielle, we have to stop soon. Just a short.
Sure. And then the second thing, which was just to say, so kind of contemporary kind of agencies, so kind of people who are kind of asking us to act as individuals today. That's precisely the point I was trying to make at the end of the presentation, which is by looking at these paintings, it encourages us to think about the way in which kind of industry has been present in the landscape kind of over a much longer period than indeed our own lifespans, political mandates, and so on. So kind of to contextualise that and to encourage us to think about pollution over a longer term to then motivate us to take more action. So yes, exactly that point.
Thank you very much. We'll have plenty of time to continue the discussions for each panel. Thank you very much for those two beautiful papers and great discussion with everybody. So let's have some lunch and see you later at 2:40.